The microphone screeched once before the ballroom went silent, and in that silence my son Daniel looked directly at me and said the word that would end the family as I knew it. Parasite. He said it clearly, almost proudly, like he had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. 80 guests turned their heads toward the round table near the back where I was sitting in my best navy dress, the one I had bought specifically for his promotion party, the one I had ironed twice because I wanted to look proud without looking like I was trying too hard. Daniel walked toward me holding a leather folder, the kind lawyers use for contracts, and he set it down in front of my plate between the untouched shrimp cocktail and the champagne flute I had barely sipped from. "Sign here," he said, tapping the top page with 2 fingers, "and we can both move on with our lives." The room did not laugh because they thought it was a joke. Nobody moves that fast into a joke. His girlfriend Priya stood a few feet behind him with her arms crossed and a small, satisfied smile tucked into the corner of her mouth, the kind of smile that told me she had been waiting for this moment for a long time and had probably helped write the speech. "I want you to understand something before I go further, because context is everything, and I refuse to let this story become one more tale about an ungrateful son and a bitter mother, because that framing would let too many people off the hook too easily. My name is Carol Whitfield. I am 58 years old, and for 26 years I ran the back office of a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus, Ohio, first as a bookkeeper, then as controller, then eventually as the woman who quietly kept 3 different owners from running the business into the ground through sheer financial discipline. I raised Daniel alone after his father left when Daniel was 7, and I want to be honest, I was not a perfect mother. I worked long hours. I missed some soccer games. I said no to expensive sneakers when I should have found a way to say yes, and I said yes to extra shifts when I should have stayed home. But I paid for his community college tuition out of pocket for 2 years before he transferred to Ohio State. I co-signed the loan for his first car, and when he needed $11,000 4 years ago to cover a shortfall after his failed food truck business left him buried under supplier debt, I gave it to him without asking a single question, because that is what mothers do, or at least that is what I believed mothers do. The $11,000 matters. Please remember it, because it will come back later in a way that even I did not expect. Back in the ballroom, someone near the bar let out a nervous laugh, the kind people make when they are trying to convince themselves that what they just heard was not real. I looked down at the folder. The title on the top page read Voluntary Family Separation and Release Agreement, which is not a real legal term, by the way, though it was formatted to look official, with numbered clauses and a signature line at the bottom with my name already typed in beneath it. Daniel had hired a lawyer for this, a real one, not a discount document mill. I recognized the letterhead. Whitcomb and Yates was one of the more expensive firms downtown, the kind that charged $400 an hour and mostly handled corporate contracts and estate disputes for the wealthy families on the east side of the city. My son, who 6 years earlier had asked me to help him understand what a deductible was, had somehow found the money and the sophistication to draft a document meant to formally, legally, publicly erase his mother from his life, and he had chosen to deliver it in front of 80 people at the very party I had helped pay for. "Daniel," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, because some part of me, some old, tired part of me, had been bracing for something like this for longer than I wanted to admit. "What exactly is this?" "It's simple," he said, and he had the tone of a man delivering a quarterly report, flat and rehearsed. "I've been promoted to regional director. I'm building a new life. Priya and I are getting serious, and I think it's time we both admit that you've never really supported who I'm becoming. You've held me back. You've made me feel small my whole life. I don't want that energy near my future anymore." He said energy the way people say it when they have been reading self-help books written by people 20 years younger than them. And I noticed Priya nod slowly behind him, mouthing something that looked like, "You're doing great." I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, because so many people, when they hear this story, assume I broke down at the table, and I did not there, not in front of the caterers and the co-workers and the aunt from Cleveland who had driven 3 hours to be there. What I felt instead was a very specific, very cold kind of clarity, the same clarity I used to feel at work when I found a discrepancy in the books that everyone else had missed, the moment right before you realize the numbers are not adding up because someone wanted them not to add up. I closed the folder gently, the way you close a door you plan to open again later, and I said, "I'm not signing anything at your party, Daniel. If this is truly what you want, we can talk about it properly, privately, when you've had time to think." Then I stood up, thanked the people at my table, told my son I loved him even though he had just tried to humiliate me in front of everyone he worked with, and I walked out of that ballroom with my head high and my hands shaking so badly that I had to sit in my car for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Now, most people, once they get home from a night like that, they cry themselves to sleep, or they call their sister, or they pour a glass of wine and stare at the wall. I did all three, if I'm being honest. But somewhere around 1 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with the lights off and the folder from the party still sitting unopened on the passenger seat of my car, a strange thing happened. The accountant in me woke up. 26 years of finding what people were trying to hide in spreadsheets does something to your brain. It makes you suspicious of convenient timing. And the timing of this was very convenient. Daniel had just been promoted to regional director at Marsh Bellamy Consumer Goods, a promotion that came with a base salary increase, a relocation stipend, and, I would later learn, a substantial signing bonus tied to a 5-year retention agreement. He had also, apparently, hired an expensive lawyer, moved in with Priya, and decided, all within the same 6-week window, that his mother was the reason he had never reached his potential. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I made tea, sat back down at that same kitchen table, and I did what I had done for 26 years whenever something did not add up. I started to ask questions on paper. Who benefits from this? What does Daniel gain, specifically and financially, from cutting me out publicly rather than privately? Why hire a lawyer for an emotional decision? Why draft a document with numbered clauses instead of simply having a hard conversation? And why would Priya, a woman I had met exactly 4 times, look so pleased watching my son humiliate me? I want to pause here and tell you something about Priya, because she is important, and because I did her a disservice for a long time by underestimating her the way people underestimate quiet, careful women, which is ironic given that I am one myself. Priya Anand was 29 years old, sharp, well-spoken, and worked, as far as I understood, in some kind of financial planning role, though Daniel had always been vague about the specifics. What I did not know, what I would not learn until 3 weeks later, was that Priya's actual job was as a wealth transition consultant for a boutique firm that specialized in something called legacy structuring, which is a polite phrase for helping wealthy families minimize what younger generations inherit in taxes, disputes, and apparently obligations to aging parents. I found this out entirely by accident, the way most important discoveries happen, not through some dramatic investigation but through a slip of paper. 2 weeks after the party, my sister-in-law Denise, who had also been at the promotion event, called to check on me, and in the middle of the conversation she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had run into Priya at a coffee shop downtown the week before the party, and Priya had been meeting with an older man Denise recognized as Arthur Kessler, a well-known estate attorney who specialized in something called irrevocable trust restructuring, a man whose clients were typically worth 8 figures or more. Denise thought nothing of it. I thought about nothing else for the next 4 days. Here is where I have to explain something about my own life that I had never told Daniel, mostly because I did not think it mattered, and partly because, if I am honest, I enjoyed the quiet dignity of not needing anyone to know. When my mother passed away 6 years ago, she left me the family property in rural Licking County, 42 acres of farmland that had been in our family since the 1950s. I had never developed it, never sold it, mostly because I did not know what to do with it and because it held sentimental value. But 2 years ago, a regional logistics and distribution company had approached me, unprompted, about purchasing the land for a new warehouse hub because it sat directly along a proposed highway expansion corridor. Their initial offer was $1.4 million. I had not accepted, had not even seriously entertained it, because I was still deciding what I wanted to do, and because, frankly, the idea of that much money made me nervous in a way I did not fully understand yet. I had told exactly 2 people about this offer, my accountant, and 6 months ago, in a moment of pride I now deeply regretted, my son. Suddenly the numbers started adding up in a way that made my stomach turn. Daniel had learned about the land offer. Daniel had at some point met or been introduced to Priya, whose entire profession revolved around structuring wealth transfers for families, particularly around minimizing the obligations and claims of complicating relatives, a category I now apparently occupied in my own son's mind. And 6 weeks before a public, dramatic witness severing of our relationship, Daniel had hired an expensive estate-adjacent law firm to draft a formal separation document. I am not a lawyer, but I had worked closely enough with corporate counsel over the years to understand exactly what this looked like. If Daniel could establish on paper, with witnesses and a formal document, that he had voluntarily and completely severed ties with me, that document could later be used, or at minimum referenced, to preemptively insulate him from any claims I might have on his future earnings during a divorce, from creditors, or, more disturbingly, to position himself as having no financial relationship with me at all, which mattered enormously if I ever decided to sell that land and structure how the proceeds passed down, or if he was trying to protect future inherited wealth from being characterized as marital property in a prenuptial negotiation with Priya's family, who I would later learn were in fact quite wealthy themselves. There were several possible motives tangled together, and I did not yet know which ones were real. But I knew, with the same certainty I felt reading a set of cooked books, that you never supported who I'm becoming was not the real reason my son had done this in front of 80 people. It was theater, and theater requires a script, a director, and an audience, and I intended to find out who had written it. I did not confront Daniel right away. This is important, because I know some people listening to this will want me to have marched over to his apartment and demanded answers, and if I had done that, I would have gotten nothing but denial and a wounded, self-righteous performance about how I was, once again, making everything about myself. Instead, I did what I had done for 26 years when I suspected something was wrong in a business relationship. I gathered information quietly, patiently, and without tipping my hand. I called my land and I called my accountant, a woman named Sylvia Ruiz, who had handled my taxes for over a decade and who I trusted completely. I asked her carefully whether there was any legitimate legal mechanism by which a parent's future asset sale or a family estrangement document could be used to affect a third party's financial position. Sylvia, bless her, did not ask why I wanted to know. She simply explained patiently that formal estrangement, especially if witnessed and notarized, could indeed be used strategically in certain prenuptial negotiations, particularly if one party wanted to argue there was no expectation of future inherited wealth, or in some cases, to distance oneself from a parent whose assets might later attract creditor claims or lawsuits. Which made me think, for the first time, that perhaps this was not only about my land. Perhaps Daniel had debts I did not know about. That thought sent me down a different path entirely, and it was Denise, again, who unknowingly cracked the case wide open. She mentioned, during another one of our calls, that Daniel and Priya had been looking at a house in the Grandview Heights neighborhood, an area with home prices well beyond what a newly promoted regional director's salary could comfortably support, at least not without significant financial backing from somewhere. I did something then that I am not entirely proud of, though I do not regret it either. I am by nature and by profession a woman who understands public records, liens, and financial filings, and I spent an evening doing what any determined person with library access and mild internet literacy can do. I searched county property and court records under my son's name. What I found explained everything. 18 months earlier, Daniel had taken out a significant personal loan, not from a bank but from a private lender connected to Priya's family, specifically to cover the remaining debt from his failed food truck venture. Debt he had told me, 4 years ago, had been fully resolved with the $11,000 I gave him. It had not been resolved. He had used part of that money and taken on additional debt to keep the business alive for another 18 months before it finally, quietly folded, and rather than tell me, or tell anyone, he had borrowed from Priya's family to make the remaining creditors go away before they could pursue legal action that might have shown up on background checks for the kind of corporate promotions he was chasing. Priya's family, it turned out, had not lent that money out of pure generosity. There was a repayment structure, and part of that structure, I suspected though could not yet prove, involved Daniel demonstrating financial independence and stability, including, potentially, distance from a mother whose financial situation was, to put it plainly, unclear and unpredictable to outsiders, a woman who might one day need support, or who might come with baggage that a controlling, image-conscious family would prefer not to inherit. I sat with this for several days, turning it over, testing it against everything I knew about my son, and here is the honest, painful truth I eventually had to accept. Daniel was not purely a villain in this story, and I never wanted to tell it as though he was. He was a young man drowning in shame over a failed business, terrified of appearing weak in front of a woman he loved and her accomplished family, and he had made a series of increasingly desperate choices to protect an image rather than admit a truth. Priya, and likely her family, had seen an opportunity in that shame and, whether through direct manipulation or simply through the quiet pressure of never once saying, "Your mother is fine, don't worry about her," had guided him toward believing that a clean, dramatic break from me was not cruelty but strategy, self-preservation dressed up as maturity. Understanding this did not excuse what happened at that party, but it told me exactly where to aim, and it told me the fight I needed to win was not against my son's cruelty, because cruelty is not what was truly driving him. It was against the manipulation that had convinced him cruelty was necessary. I decided not to call Daniel. I decided to call Priya's father instead. This was, I admit, a calculated risk, and I spent 2 full days deciding whether it was the right move before I made it. I had met Anand exactly once at a dinner Daniel had arranged 8 months earlier, a stiff, formal evening where I had felt distinctly out of place among people discussing property portfolios and private school admissions. He had struck me as a proud man, protective of his daughter, and more importantly, as someone who valued precision and directness, someone who would respect a woman who came to him with facts rather than tears. I requested a meeting through a polite, professionally worded email, stating simply that I had information relevant to Daniel and Priya's financial arrangement that I believed he would want to understand before any further family or legal steps were taken. I did not mention the party. I did not mention feeling hurt. I gave him nothing emotional to dismiss. He agreed to meet me at a quiet coffee shop, not his office, which told me he was curious but cautious. I brought with me a simple folder of my own, far less dramatic than the leather one my son had presented at his party, but far more dangerous in what it contained. Copies of public county filings showing Daniel's undisclosed lender arrangement. A printout of the highway corridor development plan showing the projected route through my Licking County property, along with the appraisal letter from the logistics company showing their $1.4 million offer, an offer I had, in the interim, quietly had re-verified and updated by a second independent appraiser, who now valued the land closer to $1.6 million given recent zoning approvals. And finally, a simple, calm letter I had written myself, explaining that I had never had any intention of leaving my estate to a son who had cut ties with me, not out of spite, but because that is simply how inheritance works. and that any financial planning built around an assumption that Daniel would eventually inherit a significant windfall from me was built on a foundation that no longer existed, effective the moment he handed me that folder in front of 80 guests. Anand read through the documents in near silence, his expression unreadable in the way that men who negotiate for a living train themselves to be. When he finished, he looked up at me and said something I will never forget. "You understand," he said slowly, "that I did not know about the loan structure being tied to any expectation about you specifically. That was Priya's initiative, not mine. I believed him mostly, though I have never fully decided how much of that was true and how much was a proud father protecting his daughter's reputation in front of a stranger. What I did know, watching his face carefully, the way I used to watch the faces of executives when I presented them with numbers that contradicted what they wanted to hear, was that he was recalculating something in real time. And that recalculation had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with risk. A daughter engaged, or nearly engaged, to a man who had hidden significant business debt, who had accepted a private loan under what now looked like a strategic condition involving public humiliation of his own mother, and who had just cost the family's carefully structured financial arrangement its entire underlying assumption, was suddenly a very different kind of risk than the golden, promoted regional director he had been introduced to 8 months earlier. I left that meeting without asking Anand to do anything specific. I did not ask him to intervene, to punish Daniel, or to change anything about his daughter's relationship. I simply gave him accurate information and let him draw his own conclusions, because I had learned a long time ago, sitting across from executives trying to hide bad numbers, that people do not need to be told what to do once they finally see the real picture. They act in their own interest once the fog clears, and I trusted that Anand, protective father and careful businessman that he was, would do exactly that. What happened over the following month unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability that almost frightened me. I later learned, mostly through Denise, who had become an unlikely and invaluable source of information, that Anand had sat down with Priya within days of our meeting, and the conversation had not gone the way Priya expected. He was apparently far less concerned with whether Daniel loved his mother than with why Daniel had felt it necessary to hide a significant debt and orchestrate what increasingly looked, from the outside, like a manufactured public spectacle rather than an honest, painful family conflict. Real estrangements, Anand reportedly told his daughter, happen in private over years through genuine hurt. They do not happen with hired attorneys and leather folders at promotion parties in front of 80 witnesses. That kind of theater, he said, is not what heartbreak looks like. It is what strategy looks like. Daniel, for his part, did not know any of this was happening, not for weeks. He called me twice during that period, both times leaving short, clipped voicemails asking whether I had thought about the paperwork, and both times I did not call back, not out of spite, but because I genuinely had nothing to say to him yet that would not come out as either rage or begging, and I refused to offer him either. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not one I orchestrated, though I have to admit I had prepared for it the way I prepared for every difficult conversation in 26 years of corporate finance, with documentation, with calm, and with the absolute refusal to raise my voice first. Daniel showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening in early October, 6 weeks after the party, without calling ahead, and he looked different than he had at the promotion event. Thinner, tired. The confident, rehearsed man who had said Parasite into a microphone was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he had not slept properly in days. Priya's family pulled the loan restructuring, he said, standing on my porch, not even waiting for me to invite him in. They're saying I lied about the debt. They're saying things about you, about the land, about some kind of financial motive, and I don't even understand what's happening, and I need you to tell me if you did something. I let him stand there for a moment before I answered, not out of cruelty, but because I needed him to sit in that discomfort the way I had sat in mine for 6 weeks. I didn't do anything to you, Daniel, I finally said. I told the truth to someone who deserved to hear it before he let his daughter build a life on a lie you told her. You hid 18 months of debt. You borrowed money under conditions you never fully explained to me. And you stood in front of 80 people, including my coworkers of over 2 decades, and called your mother a parasite because it was easier than admitting you were ashamed and scared. I paused, and then I added the part that I think finally broke through to him. I gave you $11,000 4 years ago because I believed you when you said it would fix things. It didn't fix anything, did it? It just bought you time to build a bigger lie. He did not answer for a long time. He sat down on my porch steps, the same steps he used to sit on waiting for the school bus 20 years earlier, and he put his head in his hands, and for the first time since the party, I saw something that looked less like calculated performance and more like an exhausted young man finally out of strategies. I thought if I looked stable enough, he said quietly, successful enough, independent enough, none of it would matter. I thought if I cut you out cleanly, on paper, it would prove I didn't need anyone's help, that I'd built everything myself. He looked up at me. I didn't think about what it would actually do to you. I just thought about what it would prove. I did not forgive him that night, and I want to be honest about that too, because too many of these stories end with an easy, Immediate reconciliation that does not reflect how real trust rebuilds, slowly and with conditions. What I told him instead was that I loved him, that I always would, but that love and access were not the same thing, and that he had spent 6 weeks treating me like a liability to be managed rather than a person to be honest with. And that kind of damage does not undo itself in a single porch conversation. I told him I was not interested in punishing him further, that I had no desire to ruin his career or his relationship, that I had simply refused to let a lie about me be the foundation other people built their decisions on. What happened between him and Priya, and between him and her family, was now genuinely out of my hands, and had been from the moment I walked out of that ballroom. The relationship between Daniel and Priya did not survive the fallout, not because I destroyed it, but because it had been built on a version of him that did not actually exist. And once the debt, the loan conditions, and the manufactured estrangement came to light, Priya's own trust in him collapsed under weight it was never designed to hold. I felt no satisfaction in that, only a quiet, sad confirmation that Sylvia had been right about one thing all along. That people who build their foundations on hidden lies eventually watch those foundations give way, usually not because someone attacks them, but because the truth simply gets heavier over time until it can no longer be carried quietly. As for the land, I did eventually sell it, nearly a year later, for $1.7 million after a small bidding adjustment between two competing logistics firms, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not cut Daniel out of my will or my life in some triumphant, permanent gesture of revenge, because that was never what I wanted, not even in my angriest moments sitting alone in my car outside that ballroom. What I did instead was something slower and I think more meaningful. I set up a modest trust for him, not handed over freely, but structured with conditions tied to transparency. The same kind of conditions I had spent 26 years building into corporate agreements to protect people from their own worst instincts, requiring him to meet with a financial counselor, to be honest about debts before funds were released, to rebuild trust through demonstrated behavior rather than declared intentions. It was not punishment. It was the kind of structure I wish someone had put around him years earlier, before shame taught him that hiding was safer than honesty. Daniel and I speak regularly now, nearly 2 years later. Not the same way we did before, not with the easy comfort of a relationship that had never been tested, but with something I have come to believe is more durable. A relationship built on the understanding that love without honesty is not actually love. It is just proximity, and that real family, the kind worth protecting, requires the courage to say hard, true things to each other rather than performing convenient, dramatic ones in front of an audience. He apologized properly, eventually, not with a folder or a lawyer, but with a long letter he wrote by hand, admitting not just what he had done but why, laying out the shame and fear that had driven him without using either as an excuse. I keep that letter in the same drawer where I once kept the county property records I used to unravel his lies, and I think there is something fitting about that. Evidence of a lie and evidence of a truth, sitting side by side, reminders of how close those two things can live to each other before someone finally has the courage or the patience to tell them apart.